The image of singer-songwriter Bob Dylan is one that often means a dedication to civil rights, to the working class, to the poor. And sometimes, though, those images change. And that change is what my guest, Tony Kashani, highlights in his article on Truthout titled Bob Dylan and the Ethics of Market Fascism. Hey, Tony, thanks for being on Truthout Interviews.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really enjoy the show.
Well, thank you. You don't mince words in this piece. Right out of the gate, you look at the conflation of market ideology with the Super Bowl. And that's a given, because the Super Bowl is this big spectacle that's centered around advertising. Most people tune into the Super Bowl if the game is boring to watch the ads. But when you fold in Bob Dylan selling cars for Chrysler, well, that raised a whole host of issues with you. And one was the kind of proto-fascism in the commercial message itself. And the second was Bob Dylan selling out. But let's first take the notion, or the idea, that is, of proto-fascism. Why do you think this ad has proto-fascist elements in it?
Well, proto-fascism is a strong pillar of free market fundamentalism, in my view, because it's exclusionary. Not in its application, because we look at globalization, you get the reality and data and information and facts and so on, and it's quite clear, as we were discussing this earlier, you and I, Ted, Bob Dylan himself has always been attached to Columbia Records, and he's always been part of capitalism, true and true. However, there are two facets here to look at: reality versus myth. Images versus words and auditory information that come to people. I don't need to cite studies for you to tell you with confidence that most people, if not all people on the planet, retain visual information a lot stronger and a lot longer than they would retain really strong arguments, factual arguments, and written material and so forth. So what people are left with is Bob Dylan, an iconic image in perception, if not in reality, in perception. And given his poetry being so strong, and I myself love his music, or should I say loved, and I put it in quotations. So given this iconic image, also auditory, the images of Asians and sort of creating the stereotype of Asia. Asia is the largest continent, most populous continent on the planet. The last time I looked at the statistics, there are approximately 4.3 billion people that live in Asia. And when I say Asia, I'm talking about so many different countries.
Right, and not all of them work in a factory that assembles iPhones, essentially.
Absolutely not. But imagine you're 15 years old, 16 years old, you're not quite sure about your history. You don't even know Bob Dylan, but your parents, your grandparents say, hey, this guy's a great singer. He represents America for what it was and so forth. And he's right there telling you over an image. You don't really pay attention to, the history of Bob Dylan and so forth. And the reason I used him as the centerpiece of my discussion was to draw attention to the bigger picture. And I decided to be provocative, knowing in advance that I would take a lot of heat. You can see from the comments and so forth. But that, in fact, is good news. If people are willing to take the time and attack my treatment of what is going on and the stereotyping that Bob Dylan reinforces, and how that becomes, in my view, a proto-fascist message to our citizens, young and old, that in order to be American, in order to have pride and a connection to your heritage, you must exclude others as secondary.
Okay, so Tony, that was actually a very good preface, but let's pin you down a little bit here. What exactly do you mean by proto-fascism? That's where I started my question, but let's try to attach some kind of definition to it.
So proto-fascist, the reason I attached proto to the term fascist, but in the title say market fascism, because we're moving very quickly towards that way of mentality, where when people, as Hannah Arendt famously said, if they stop thinking, then they will become complicit with a proto-fascist approach, because power wants to exclude lots of people and include those who are willing to be complicit with power. Now, in this case, It's not about, whites versus blacks or white supremacy or anything that Hitler and the history of fascism has brought us. Therefore, we're looking at a marketplace, corporatism, which you can equate with proto-fascism, dictates to the people. So if that suffices, I'll stop now because I can go on forever talking about this stuff.
Okay, no, I understand what you're saying. It's a totalizing ideology, whether it happens to be attached to a state that was fascist, like you could look at Italy, for example, or which had a state and corporatism came together, or what you're saying within this ad campaign or within neoliberalist ideology, that its logical desire, its logical endpoint is to be a totalizing ideology. So people can't think beyond that ideology of market fundamentalism. Is that correct?
I think you're absolutely on target. With the word totalitarianism is very apt. The minute you use the word pride, right, in the ways in which pride has been used by totalitarian regimes in the past, and now the corporate regimes of the present, is to inject a sort of one-way thinking, right? One giant brain thinking for everyone. And the giant brain is not needed for second order or third order thinking, for reflective common sense, but the common sense that is produced, vis-a-vis these commercials and mostly through the corporate media, which collectively speaking is part of the corporatism that I'm discussing here. And then the end result, what this yields, is what I like to call proto-fascism.
Okay. Now, the second part I wanted to get in on is the idea that Bob Dylan has sold out. Now, my view of this is different. I've been a Bob Dylan fan since I was a teenager and grew up listening to his newer output and then going back and rediscovering his older music. He was putting out music in the 80s and 90s, and that's kind of when I attached myself to his music. I found it very interesting, and then went back and discovered his back catalog, the stuff from the 60s and 70s. Now, I personally don't think that Bob Dylan is a sellout. That, in a way, it implies that his singing career has never been a commercial enterprise. It's always been a commercial enterprise. There's always the fact that there's also the fact that he's been a pitchman, right? This commercial for Chrysler, he's trying to sell a car, but he's done other advertising. He was in a Victoria's Secret ad. He was in an ad for Cadillac that also cross-promoted his show on Sirius Satellite. And then they had the yogurt ad for Chobani Yogurt that featured his song, I Want You. So I look at him, in this context, I've always seen Bob Dylan as a small C capitalist, wherein the brand is Bob Dylan. What he is selling is Bob Dylan. Now he's attaching himself to big corporate enterprises. Now, to me, that's more cringeworthy. It's like, it just doesn't feel right. But I've been watching Bob Dylan's career, and I've read a couple books about him. And one thing that I know about Bob Dylan is that he has never, ever fit into neat little boxes. He's always tried to defy expectations, even back to his film Don't Look Back, where there was it showed him as just a very irascible, irreverent kind of guy who never liked being categorized. And I think that he's been that way through his career. Now, like I said earlier, the fact that he's attaching himself to a big corporate capitalist enterprises like Chrysler or Victoria's Secret or Chobani Yogurt or whatnot, that to me is more cringeworthy. But I've never seen that his career in itself is a sellout, because I've always seen him as a small C capitalist.
Okay, well, let me respond to that. To begin with, there's nothing that you said here that I disagree with. You have looked into his history. You've been a fan. You looked at the history of Bob Dylan's trajectory, which, in your view, and I happen to agree with it, he has carefully not boxed himself in one category or labeled himself and so on. This article was not about Dylan. Using Dylan was a centerpiece to draw attention. I knew lots of people are going to think about this. It's as if I am trying to put the proverbial mirror in front of their face and say, yes, take a look. This is history of Bob Dylan. Lots of people I will hazard a guess that people have read the piece, have gotten some kind of angry, and said, well, let me look into this. And they looked at history of Bob Dylan, as you explained, very nicely, concisely. And now that there has, he's always been this kind of a person. Now it's on a broader scale. Now he is the biggest part of the spectacle. Just a few minutes ago, before we were to go on air, I looked at the number of hits on YouTube, and it has come up to 11,325,739.
This is for the ad that he did?
This is for the official version of the ad on YouTube, and there are other versions that people have been looking at. And there are 9,503 likes and 3,233 dislikes. So the ratio of people who kind of didn't like this and people who did like it is 9-3. However, there's a national dialogue going on. And that is my point. We are in desperate need of a national dialogue that is sound. Of course, it's going to start out with lots of crazies entering the picture, which is fine. That's what a democracy ought to be about. But if you're thinking like Socrates used to think, if you're asking the right questions, if you're constantly digging for the truth, I'm talking about truth with the lowercase, not the truth, the capital T. That doesn't apply anymore. Reality is not what it used to be. Therefore, Bob Dylan's ad is a sellout, not so much Bob Dylan the man. The bigger picture is really the question here. What are your ethics? Is what I'm asking implicitly with this article. I'm saying, take a look at the mirror. Are you willing to look? Do you look away? Do you get angry and lash back? Or do you rethink your values based on, is it your values are based on economic factors, or your values based on moral factors that you bring into picture? You make decisions about your life.
You bring up the jingoistic rhetoric embedded in the ad, and I read some of the comments on your Truthout piece, which you got quite a few. You're over 400 at this point, and that's a lot. That's a lot of dialogue. So it looks like what you set out to do, you accomplished, which was to spur people into talking about their preconceived notions about whether it's Bob Dylan or about corporate capitalism. But one commenter who goes by the name of Bet Power said that he didn't think that Dylan uttering the lines about the Germans, the Swiss, and especially the Asians was jingoistic. And I'll read what he said. He says, I read the Chrysler ad completely differently than you do. I read it as an attempt by Dylan to raise the spirit of our currently downtrodden American people, whose fortunes, the 99%, have been eviscerated by the global economy. It is an attempt to reinstill pride in Americans about America. That is nowhere near the same as jingoism.
The commenter proves my point. You are looking at the images, you're looking at the words, you're looking at Bob Dylan trying to instill pride and the spirit for Americans to do the right thing and pick themselves up and so on. With the label Chrysler, I mean, Chrysler is wholly owned by Fiat, a European company. Chrysler was bailed out by the American people. And are they, Detroit? Is he referring to, which Detroit is he referring to? He's talking about the Detroit of the past. And then images of the Autobahn and this and that, as if Detroit created the world. The auto industry has been very successful at suppressing any attempts by the populace, by mass of Americans who wanted mass transit, who wanted excellent mass transit. Or is Detroit looking at China and other places who are at the forefront and the pioneering parts of building mass transit infrastructure and so forth? No. Because they're Asian, or because they're this, or because they're that. They're not American. As if being an American, what does he say in the beginning of the ad? I'm sure he didn't write the script, or at least I'm guessing he didn't. But whoever did is probably a disciple of, free market fundamentalism. He says, is there anything more American than America? Is there anything more potato-like than potato?
Right, I know. It's kind of a silly question, right?
Right. But we're used to that, right? So the person who put this comment in and saying, well, what I'm seeing is pride, and Bob Dylan really trying to instill pride. I'm sorry, I don't see that. What Bob Dylan is trying to instill is, look at these images, right? The the Zoom and so on. Look at me, the icon, the guitar, and my song, and so on. And that's America, because there's nothing more American than America. So forget about, fighting for raising the minimum wage to a point where, $10 is not enough. We know that. Forget about universal health care. Forget about this and that. What you want is cars. You want, absolute American cars, the American brand, and so on. But there's no such thing as American brand anymore. This is the global world. So my response to the commenter is that take a careful look around you, and think about reevaluating what pride really means. Right? Does pride mean that we must treat others without dignity, or does pride mean that we want to be treated with dignity, and in turn we treat everybody else with dignity?
Well, Tony, I really want to thank you so much for being on Truthout Interviews.
Well, thank you, Ted. This was a great opportunity. I appreciate the opportunity.
Tony Kashani is author, a writer with Truthout. His article called Bob Dylan and the Ethics of Market Fascism certainly accomplished its goal, which was to get us talking about our preconceived notions. And that's Truthout Interviews for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. We'll see you next time.